All right, so we are going to do the evidence for evolution in this video. So just a sec. Okay, so this one will be kind of a shorter summary. So we have a couple different categories of evidence for evolution. We have the fossil record. Here, we'll hide that. The fossil record, which shows us transition species. We also can look at the anatomical record. And in this, we've got two separate areas we're going to talk about, homologous structures and then vestigial structures. Then we can look at the molecular record, and you can look at this either from a protein or a DNA sequence standpoint. And then we can also look at artificial selection. So in our traditional 5 types of evidence, usually we're talking about the fossil record, the homologous anatomical structures, the vestigial anatomical structures, and then both the molecular protein record and the molecular DNA record. Artificial selection is just more evidence, so we're going to talk about that as well. All right, natural selection in action. So what I want to talk about is an example of natural selection in action, so we can kind of see how it's happening before we go into some more details. So first, drug resistance. You have antibiotics. It doesn't kill all the bacteria. Some are naturally drug resistant. These will be from like a random mutation, something like that. Now, what happens is you kill all the ones that are not resistant, so the only ones that survive are the resistant bacteria. Because the survivors are the ones that reproduce, resistance, if it is inherited, is then passed down. And so the antibiotic is now less and less effective. This is another example over here. This is the same thing, but with pesticide resistance. So here we have an insecticide being sprayed on our crop. We have 1 out of 5 of these bugs is resistant to the insecticide. So this one survivor goes on and has babies, and because this chromosome has a gene for that resistance, his progeny or her progeny are all going to have that same resistance gene. Now, depending on how that is conferred, we talked about in genetics dominance and recessiveness. In a sexual selection system, maybe not 100% of the survivors would have it, but it would still be a much higher percent that should have it down here than would have been in the original population here. All right, here's another bit of evidence of natural selection, industrial melanism, so the peppered moth. So what we would have is we would have had these white-barked birch trees, and then during the Industrial Revolution, the bark of the tree became speckled with the dust and soot from factories. So what happened was the white moths became much easier snacks than the more peppered or darker colored moths. So the moths would range from almost pure black to pure white, and then with lots of variation in between. So in areas like London, where they had lots of factories, the white moths went nearly extinct, and we saw most of the moths were more dark. In areas outside the city, it remained what it had previously been, which was that on a white tree, this black moth would be the easiest one for a bird to spot and then gobble up. So that's more evidence of natural selection. All right, and now we're going to talk a little bit about how populations evolve. So natural selection acts on individuals. So remember, natural selection acts on individuals by causing them to have differential survival and then differential reproductive success. But the population is what evolves. So the population is our genetic makeup of the population, the total population genes there over time. So favorable traits, the ones that confer the greater fitness, that give them the ability to survive or the ability to reproduce, those are the ones that become more common. So natural selection will act on individuals. It might say that this individual is more fit because it has trait X. And so this individual might have twice as many babies or might survive to reproduce, and this one might die. So natural selection acts on the level of the individual, but evolution happens on the level of the population. So here we can see the frequency of a cold adapted allele, and the frequency of that allele increases when we have latitude increasing. So as we get further north, we get colder, and so we have more of that allele. And that's because fish that don't have that cold adapted allele, they can't survive in the more northern climates. Now, in order for evolution to happen, you need this raw material. must be differences in the population. Some individuals have to be more fit than others. So not only do you have to have differences, but you also have to have some animals be more fit than others. And then that variation comes from mutation, sex. Those are the two main categories. So first, mutation. Those are random changes, errors in mitosis, errors in meiosis. Or environmental damage. That's what can cause like skin cancers, environmental damage that causes mutation. So those are where we get mutation from. Now, when I say sex, what we mean here is the mixing of alleles. So that recombination we get when we have new combinations from a mom and a dad into the offspring. So we get these new combinations, and sometimes this can result in new phenotypes or different percentages of phenotypes. Also, we get variation because offspring can inherit traits from the parent. In crossing over, we can have that variation like transferred in a couple of different ways. Remember when we talked about crossing over, we might have our pair. And so if we have genes here, if we have crossing over that happens above that, those would switch places. So we would have them on different chromosomes. So that's going to allow for more variation. And then also random fertilization by sperm. So you have a random egg being mixed with a random sperm. So not just the two parents, but also what genes are those two parents giving, because remember, they're only giving half of their like alleles because they're giving like one copy per gene. All right. So for practice, I want you to give an example of a kind of environmental change that could cause natural selection. And for today, I only want you to understand those categories of evidence for evolution. You don't have to go into the details on those different categories. All right.